Hi folks, Vipin here. Today's topic would be about government companies. This is a topic which is important for the first PU students. So let's look into this topic in detail. Now, firstly, let's understand what is the meaning of a government company. A government company is a company where the share capital is owned by the government. Now, how much does the government own minimum? 51%. Now, once a government company has been set up, they can either be set up as a private limited company or they can be established as a public limited company. But most importantly, in order to be called as a government company, they must have the government's control here to a minimum of 51%. Remember, minimum 51% the government must have in control. Okay. Now there are three types of government companies. The first one we would discuss here would be a department undertaking. Now, what is the department undertaking? Firstly, department undertakings are the oldest forms of a company. That is, the government being the head of these institutions. Now, who is the head of a department company? The head being here would be a minister. Okay. Now, all department companies are funded by a budget. Now, two examples which I would consider here would be the Indian Railways and our very own BMTC. If you are a resident of Bangalore, I am sure you would have used the BMTC services at least once. Now, when it comes to the railways, as of February this year, the railway minister has been Mallikarjun Kharge. Now, when it comes to the head of BMTC, it's in fact the Transport Minister Ramlinga Reddy. Now, I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. Department undertakings are in fact funded by a budget. Now, it's very clear that for railways, there happens to be a special budget altogether. They call it as the railway budget itself. So, a department undertaking like the railways is in fact having a separate budget altogether. And then employees are called government employees. Now, why are they called government employees? Because the salaries happen to be paid by the government. Now, what do I mean by salaries being paid by the government? When you have a budget being put in place, the budget is what estimates how much salary is to be given to each employee in the government. Now, because of that, they are called as a government employee. Okay. Now, if I were to refer to some government colleges, the people in my profession who happen to be working in a government college, there's a separate budget in India for education itself. A part of the education budget is what comes into their account as salary. So it's in fact the government that's paying you, and only then are you called as a government employee. And then centralized decision making. Now, when you have a minister who is looking after this organization, the minister is the sole person who is in fact taking the decisions when it comes to any matter. Now, I'll give you more examples of that in some time. Revenue is retained by the government. Now, institutions like the railways make crores together in a year, several thousand crores in fact. So all this money is in fact retained by the government in the form of their revenue. It's one of the biggest sources of revenue for the government when they run the Indian Railways. Other sources of revenue is also the post office department, the sale of stamps, the courier service that they have, all that happens to be a part of their revenue sources. So all the revenue that is made there is retained by the government. It goes into the government treasury, you could say. So let's look at department undertakings in a little bit more detail. Now, as I mentioned, I've considered the example of BMTC here. The first point that I made is a minister is in fact heading a department undertaking. BMTC is a department undertaking, and therefore you have Ramlinga Reddy, who happens to be the head of this organization. Below that, I've put a newspaper headline: BMTC boosts connectivity to villages. Now, I made a point previously here, point number 4, wherein centralized decision making. Now, centralized decision making can be seen in this headline, wherein I've said The Transport Minister Ramlinga Reddy said the biggest benefit of the new service would be that the villagers would no longer have to wait for several hours to catch a bus. Now here it's Ramlinga Reddy who's actually introducing these bus services into the rural places. It's not in fact a director of BMTC who's doing it. It's not some manager or a supervisor who's doing it. It happens to be the minister who's making this possible. So it's in fact one guy who's deciding the whole thing. And that's why you call it as centralized decision making. The next thing, I told you that in department undertakings they are funded by a budget. Point number 2. So here you can actually see there's an accounts department. In the accounts department, the paragraph that you can see there, they've actually mentioned that the department is responsible for preparing a budget. That is around line number 6, I think. They've actually mentioned that the department is responsible for preparing a budget for the future expenses, and in fact deciding the costs, maintenance, salary, all this. So this is a department undertaking. Moving on, statutory company. A statutory company can be established only by passing a special act in the parliament or the state legislature. State legislature, I'm not aware of any statutory company established through the state legislature, but I'll focus on this from the parliament point of view. Okay. Now, statutory companies are established for regulation work. What is the regulation work? I'll explain in some time. Statutory companies take decisions without the interference of the government. Now, RBI is an example of a statutory company. Now, RBI has come out with a new system for opening a bank account. Now, one of the practices that they put in is something called as KYC, know your customer or know your client. Now, what happens here is, previously when you wanted to open a bank account, photocopies of the documents were good enough. Now, RBI has made it mandatory that the photocopies must be verified alongside the originals, and it's been made mandatory that you must and should have a PAN card when you want to open a bank account. Now, this is a small part of KYC. This rule might sound very inconvenient for many people. And even though it sounds inconvenient, you never had a politician, you never had any member of the government interfere and say you're causing inconvenience for the people by putting across this rule. Now, KYC is a very serious matter. There is even possibility that they can even do background checks on the customer. So even with all this rule put in place, you never saw any minister go about filing an objection saying that no, this is something which is too unruly, you're invading people's privacy, none of that. So no interference from the government. Employees are not called government employees. The reason being, institutions like SEBI, institutions like Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, they are self-sufficient in their funds. When I say self-sufficient, I mean when they are established, they are given capital by the government. But over a course of time, whatever revenue they make, that revenue is in fact retained by these organizations. When the revenue is retained by these organizations, they use this money to pay the employee's salary. They're not asking the government to pay the employee's salary. The organization itself pays their salary. Hence, they're not actually called as a government employee. Last point, revenue earned is not given to any government. Now, here, the revenue earned by Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, that's one exception when it comes to revenue being given to the government to an extent. But institutions like RBI, institutions like SEBI, whatever revenue they make is in fact not given to any government. Okay, and now, to explain statutory companies in a little bit detail, SEBI bars Prayag Infotech promoters from raising public funds. Now, this is how powerful a statutory company can get. Now, the reason SEBI has done this is because they've probably violated some rule, some clause in the agreement. Now, a statutory company is put in place to make sure things work smoothly. Especially an institution like SEBI is in fact the watchdog for the capital markets in the country. Now if they find suspicious, SEBI immediately takes action, and there is no one really to go about questioning this. You may have heard about the Sahara Group incident, where SEBI in fact has put a very strong case against the Sahara Group, and the company is compelled to pay upwards of 22,000+ crores to its investors. So that's how powerful this organization can get. One more news when it comes to SEBI: 1,389 defaulters have not paid 136 crores as penalty. Now these could be companies. SEBI puts across penalties every other day in case they find any documentation incorrect, any error in filing documents. All that is something which SEBI takes very seriously. I had made another video about how Unilever did not file a document, just a 3-page document, and because they did not file that, SEBI put a 50 lakh penalty for not filing that document. So this is how serious and how strict statutory companies work in this country, and they're in fact responsible for making the industries run smoothly. One of the reasons why the banking sector in India was able to live through the 2008 recession and you never saw a single bank in India collapse, my credit for that would be in fact for RBI. I in fact thank RBI for making the financial system of this country, the banking system of this country, in fact so stable. Okay, and now public sector undertakings, or just PSUs as they're called. In a PSU, 51% shares are held by the government. Now, unlike in the previous cases, statutory and department, in both those cases you have the government having 100% in their account. This is one of the reasons why you are not able to buy shares of SEBI or buy shares of Indian Railways. I'll get to that in some time. Established to make profits and compete with the private sector. State Bank of India, for example, although is a government bank, will not provide interest rates at a rate which is lower than what the other banks are offering. These banks are not set up to provide a service to the people, a service as in a benefit to people to reduce their burden. That's not what they're there for. They will offer the rate of interest as much as what any other bank in the private sector would offer. In fact, SBI is one of the most profitable banks in the country. So they are in fact established to make profit. Shares of PSUs can be bought by the public. Like I said, I cannot buy shares of BMTC. I cannot buy shares of the Indian Railways. I however have shares of SBI, and I also think I have shares of Bank of Baroda, which also happens to be a PSU in fact. Directors are elected by the shareholders. Now in the previous two cases, RBI and in the case of department undertakings, the government goes about appointing the directors. RBI, a statutory company, in those cases a government appoints them. In this case, the shareholders meetings are held, and I, being a shareholder of SBI, I could attend these meetings and I could go about appointing a new director whenever the time comes. Revenue is retained by the PSU. Now in case of the last quarter of State Bank of India, they earned around 3,300 something crores. Now all this revenue is in fact retained by SBI. They will not pay any part of their revenue to the government. These companies pay taxes, but they don't give a part of their revenue away to the government as a benefit for them. One good advantage a PSU has is, in case these PSUs were to go down, say they get into a financial crisis, the government immediately goes about providing them financial assistance. That's not really possible in the private sector. And now, some more points to explain about public sector undertakings. You have the SBI chairman, Arundhati Bhattacharya. Now this lady has been in fact appointed by shareholders. People like me who have shares, we appointed her. State Bank of India's net profit falls to about 34%. Now there again, this company is in fact intending to make profits. They will go about providing their services at a cost, and we are the people who are supposed to bear that cost. Just because it's the government doesn't mean I can get an education loan from them at 0% rate of interest. They will still charge me a good rate of interest. One more, like I said, you can buy shares of a PSU. I mentioned that in the previous point number 3, shares of PSUs can be bought by the public. Here you can see you actually get stock tips of what company shares you can buy. If you're an investor, you get this regularly. Now, this is one thing which I found on a website: buy SBI at 1947 rupees 1947. Now, this is something that's possible only because SBI is a PSU. Now, I will not get stock tips of buying shares of RBI or buying shares of SEBI or BMTC. Those shares cannot be bought by the public. So this is in fact the information when it comes to public sector companies or government companies, as you would call them. I hope you found this video informative. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day. Bye.